One of the things that I think is the most exciting thing about getting to know how God works in our life is experiencing Him at work, right? Our church is undergoing a revelation and a revolution all at one time. We're changing the way we used to do things to try to reach people here in St. Cloud. Pray and Go is a part of that. But there's a whole bunch of things, the garden and many other things going on. And as we all work together and we see God at work, it's going to lift all of us up. It's going to lift all of our faith. It's going to help us to see God at work. And that's so exciting. And that plays right into what I'm going to be sharing this morning. We're having a conversation about enjoying life the way that God intends, by walking in His unmerited favor. That's His grace. God's unmerited favor is God working in our hearts to cause us to be like Jesus Christ, to share the character of Jesus Christ to the people that are around us. That's what the Christ life is all about. The power of right behavior is in right believing. Jonathan shared that last week, actually over the last couple weeks. So if the power of right behavior is in right believing, the key specifically is realizing that trying on our own self-effort, isn't enough to cause us to be good, to do good things. But trusting in the effort of the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of Jesus Christ, always ends in His success. So we can either depend on ourselves or we can depend on Him. And that's really what the Christ life is all about. Learning how to not depend on ourselves and to depend on Him instead. Human beings, we talked about this in our Connect group a little while ago. Human beings are focused from birth on self-sufficiency. Ever since our ancestors ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and became self-aware, mankind, men and women from throughout all of history, we have learned to be self-sufficient. We find it very difficult to trust. We want to solve all of our own problems. And when you're an engineer by college education, you're even worse because you want to solve problems. That's what we do. We innately want to try every possible solution before we trust someone else. Maybe even especially before we're willing to trust God Himself. That's where people are. So today I'm going to discuss a very important question, and that is, how do we learn to trust? There's a well-known corporate retreat kind of an exercise. I just lost my slides here, so give me a moment. But you know this little exercise here where someone will cross their arms and fall backwards, and the rest of the team will catch that person. And the whole idea is, well, you learn to trust your teammates, your coworkers, because when they catch you, you go, well, yeah, maybe they've got my back. Maybe they will help me out. I think the reality is not so much that in a corporate retreat, but in a situation where you actually work with people day by day, doing work together, you gain trust in them because they actually do help you. You help them. It becomes a relationship where you work together. And over time, you develop trust. Here's the thing. God is God. He shouldn't have to earn our trust like that. For crying out loud, we should trust Him without question. But He is God, and He's willing to earn our trust. To me, that's incredibly exciting because He knows how weak we are. He knows how messed up we are, and He's willing to earn that trust. So how do we actually learn to trust in God? And the answer is experience, like what we're going to be sharing later on in the message in the service here today. Working in the garden, working on all these different areas of service and ministry to demonstrate His love to other people. So we learn to trust God from both good and bad events in our life. We learn to trust God as He provides for our needs. We learn to trust God from seeing Him at work during difficult and even excruciating times in our life. We learn to trust God as He provides and as He influences us to reflect his character in all circumstances. John himself, John, let me rephrase, Jesus himself was quoted by John as saying, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble. I don't know about you guys, but I have it all the time. Trouble that I don't think is necessarily of my doing, it's just circumstances. Bad stuff has happened, right? And we live through that. But it's actually those troubles that is a key to gaining trust with God, because we learn through experience. And the key to learning from those experiences, the power of right perspective. The truth is that Jesus allows trouble in our life to help us move from self-sufficiency to Jesus dependency. It sounds so simple, but it's not. Again, because of our flesh, we want to do things ourselves. We were talking again in Connect Group just a little while ago, and it really is a lifelong process. Paul described it this way in Philippians 1. He said, I thank my God every time I remember you, being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. The thing is, when we place faith in Jesus Christ and become a Christian, we become a believer, that's just the beginning. Everything goes from there. And what God is trying to do is make us more like Jesus Christ, because that's his goal. He wants us to be like him. So I'm about to share something. I'm not sure if I'm going to get through this without a few tears, but I'm going to give it a shot. I've gone over this message a few times over the last few days, and I haven't done it yet, but let's see what happens now. This week, by coincidence, is the 21st anniversary of the worst week of my life. You guys know, I believe, that our sons, Alan and Michael, were both adopted. And on April 6th of 2020, Michael was born. Barb was actually in the delivery room when his birth mom had him, and she stayed there at the hospital in Rochester Hills, Michigan, and it was an exciting time. That was on a Thursday, I believe. On Saturday, we brought the little guy home, and everything was going swimmingly. Things were going great. Alan was 3.5 at the time. He was excited to be a big brother. And on the 18th of April, about 2 weeks later, I received a call from the adoption agency that the birth parents had changed their mind, and we had to give Michael back. Michigan law, I still believe it's the case, but it certainly was then, was such that if the birth parents change their mind on what they call a temporary placement, that for any reason whatsoever they can change their mind, and until they actually go before a judge personally and terminate their parental rights and sign the paperwork to that effect, the adoption does not go forward, and the birth parents get the baby back, and that's what happened in this case. You can maybe imagine how difficult that was for us. It was a horrifying situation, and it's hard to describe. So I'm just going to try to do my best to walk you through what happened. Barb was actually out that evening at an event at church, I believe, a baby shower or something for someone else. And I made the mistake of telling Alan what was going on, and 3.5 years old, right? And he just started to cry. He yelled, "No!" and he ran to his room and slammed the door. I felt the same way. The rest of Tuesday and all day Wednesday was like we were living in a living nightmare. We were both in a state of shock. We were crying every moment we thought of Michael and what was going on, and that was almost all the time. The one thing I would say is that God in his grace allowed me to be maybe in a better state when Barb was in her worst moments, and vice versa, so that we were able to help each other through it. But it was a really rough time. We got up early on Thursday morning. We took the last of Michael's things and we put them in the basement so they wouldn't be around the house when we got home. And we loaded up the van and started the drive down to Southfield. We took Alan and left him off at some good friends of ours, Alan and actually Mike and Stacy Allen. Mike is actually Michael's namesake, so we dropped Alan off at their house and we took Michael on down to the agency. And we arrived there about 10 in the morning. We had to warm a bottle and feed Michael, and really for the last time. And Barb gave Michael to me, and I held him for a few moments, and then I handed him back to her. I thought I was going to do better. Anyway, we walked over to the room where the birth parents were. She told them a little bit about his situation. He was doing really well. 2 weeks old, he was sleeping through the night, which was exciting for young parents. Then I told Michael's birth parents some things I just really felt I had to tell them. And I told them that the only way you can really have a relationship with God is to accept Jesus Christ as the solution to the sin problem that we all have. We only accomplish that by trusting in Jesus Christ. And I said to Michael's birth father, his name is Jeff, I said, sometime in the future, when you're watching a football game on TV with this little guy, you might see someone in the stands waving a sign that says John 3:16. And I said, the words of that verse are really important, and I quoted the famous words, right? And my voice broke when I got to, he gave his only begotten son. Obviously, God giving Jesus up was way different than me giving up Michael, but at that moment, the emotion felt a lot the same to me. It was horrifying. Throughout the conversation, Jeff said that he had started attending a church, and Michael's birth mother, Kathy, was pretty quiet. So just before we got up, I pointed out that there was a toy in the diaper bag that Alan had picked out for Michael, and we started walking out, and Barb took another look back at Michael, and I just kept walking. I'm about to read something I wrote just a few weeks after that. Barbara and I had a website back at the time frame, and I wrote this and actually posted this whole story on the website back then. So this is a direct quote. I said, even now, looking back over the events of those weeks, I am confused about why all this has happened. I don't know why God has caused Barb and I and Alan and the rest of our family to endure such a roller coaster of emotion. Going from the exaltation of having a new son and brother and having those thoughts dashed into something that's almost like a death in the family is something I don't want anyone else to ever have to go through. I don't know why all this has taken place. I might never understand why this has happened, but maybe, just maybe, it was because God wanted me to share that message of salvation with Michael's birth parents. It was a message that was painful to deliver because of the circumstances, but without the adoption situation, I would never have met them and had the opportunity to share it with them. So you might say that what a sad story about a failed adoption, and I would agree, it was a very sad time for our family, but God doesn't make mistakes. This wasn't a failed adoption at all. It was, we just don't know why things turned out the way they did. Someday we will. Again, remember, I'm writing this back in 2020. For now, though, we just have to trust in the purpose that God had and wait for, as I pray daily now, the baby God does want us to have in our family. So mentally, I'd kind of moved on. I decided that Michael's gone and that God's going to have to give us a different baby. This will be the second time this happened to us, by the way. We lost a daughter. Not that she passed away, but her birth mom changed her mind too, a year or so earlier. Our family was crushed by the loss of Mike. We had a number of really bad days, and for months afterward, Barbara and I would have a Michael moment and just need to cry. On the drive over here this morning, Barbara reminded me that after all this happened, we went back to Mike and Stacy's house, and we got Alan, and we drove to Chicago to spend the weekend just to try to clear our heads. And unfortunately, it was just a few months before that Tarzan came out, the Disney movie, and there's a song, You'll Be in My Heart. That was Alan's favorite song, and they kept playing it over and over. You'll be in my heart no matter what they say. And Barb and I would be in the front seat crying our eyeballs out, and Alan's back there having a good old time. But I remember within a week or two of all that happening, our pastor and his wife, his family took us out for lunch, and I sat across the table from them at that restaurant, and I just said, I don't even know how to pray. I don't know what to do. A few days after returning Michael, I was previewing a video for a class that Barb and I were teaching at church. The video was entitled Memorials. And it's all about the idea that Jesus, or that God rather, as the children of Israel got to the Jordan River, he opened the Jordan River and told them to walk across to go into the promised land. And he told them as they walked through, grab a rock. Every tribe, of all the 12 tribes, were to grab a rock and take them across. And when they got on the west bank, they were to pile those 12 rocks up. And it was to be a memorial, a reminder of what God did. So the teacher, his name is Gary Ezzo, he said that the idea is that we should have memorials in our lives as believers. And he and his family, he built a shadow box that they hung on the wall. And when different things happened in their family, where God had done something amazing, they'd put a physical reminder. They had a pair of shoelaces that meant something to them, and a piece of cloth that meant something, different things. And I won't tell you all his stories. But his daughters would walk by that shadow box and say, "Hey, Dad, will you tell me that story about the shoelaces again?" Or Mom, what remind me about that piece of cloth? And I listened to that video, and I turned it off. I couldn't stand it. Because here was a family that was talking about remembering how difficult things in their life meant that they learned. They learned to trust in God because of those difficulties. I turned it off and I prayed, and for the first time, I prayed that God would give our son back to us. I was actually on the board of the adoption agency where all this took place, and I was told that never happens. When you have a failed adoption, they had never in their experience had ever had a failed adoption become unfailed, if that's a word. But I was praying for that. I wasn't so sure. So when we were praying with Alan at bedtime and stuff, we'd pray that God would take care of Michael wherever he is, that God would someday lead him to the Lord through somebody. But I never prayed in front of Alan that God would bring Michael back. I'm sure Barb started to at some point too. Not sure exactly when she did. After a few more weeks went by, Barb really felt the Lord telling her to write these people, the birth parents, a letter. The adoption was going to be pretty much basically what they call a semi-open, where any communication would go through the agency. But now that it was a failed adoption, they gave us their address. They were planning on moving here to Florida. Not sure exactly where they moved to, but Barb had their address. So in June, in fact, I think you were talking to Stacy about it, Barb, and you said, "I don't want to write it, but I think I have to." And Stacy said, "Well, just write the stupid letter." So Barb did, and she sent it to them, and we heard nothing back. But a few weeks after that, we got a phone call completely out of the blue. It was actually Michael's birth aunt, his birth mom's sister. And she had gone through the suitcase when they moved back to Michigan, because they'd only been in Florida for a few weeks and they came back. Things were not going so hot. And the birth aunt found our phone number and decided to call up, and she gave us a little update. Well, Michael's doing fine. You know, he's a baby, he's healthy and all, but his birth parents were not getting along, and Michael's pretty much being taken care of by his grandmother. A few weeks later, she called again, and she said, things are so bad with Kathy and Jeff, the birth parents, that they're rethinking the adoption after all. But they have another couple in mind, and it's not going to be you guys. Don't even think about it. But I kept praying. With Michael, or with Alan rather, we just kept praying that God would take care of Michael wherever he is. But I was praying that God would bring Michael back. In late December, we got yet another call, and the birth aunt said that the birth parents just cannot take care of him. And that other couple that they had in mind was, they hadn't even started the home study, which they had to have completed to actually take a temporary placement. it was a mess, and there was no answer. And I just told her again, we will take Michael back. And she said, yeah, well, that's not going to happen. Don't worry about that. And she finally admitted that the reason for that was that they felt that I preached to them when we gave Michael back that day, when I was sharing about the Lord. Well, 2 days later, the birth aunt called again, and she said they decided to give Michael up for adoption after all, and if we're willing to take him, they'll give him back to us. I think we said yes. I'm pretty sure we did. That started a flurry of activity. We had to get the agency involved because we had to do the paperwork and all that. And arrangements were made for us to meet at the agency on Saturday evening. I think it was December 30th. We arrived at the agency, and Michael's birth aunt was there, but there was no sign of Jeff or Kathy. And after a 20-minute wait, it seemed like an eternity, Jeff finally walked in. And he started this long discussion about what's going on in their life and why this is happening. And he ended it by saying, I don't know if I'm going to do this to you again or not, which we took to mean, I might leave Michael with you now, but take him back in a few weeks. And we said, we'll still take Michael back. We'll take him back. So he went out to his truck where he'd left Michael and brought him in. And he stayed for another 45 minutes or so and finally decided that Kathy probably was not going to come in while he was there. And so he left, and sure enough, she'd been driving around the block, and when his truck was out of the parking lot, she pulled in. She spent some time with Michael alone and signed the temporary placement paperwork and left. So we had Michael back. I believe it was the 30th because I think we brought Michael to the family New Year's party the next day, and no one knew we had him back yet, so it was kind of exciting. But Michael was back with us, but obviously the situation was tenuous. They could change their mind again. Several weeks went by, things were going well. We finally heard that there was a court date. And all this time, we just kept telling Alan that, this baby Michael, his parents have us watching him for a little while. And that's, he didn't think anything of it. But it was about that time, just a few days before the court date, that Michael and Alan and I were having a conversation. Michael was in his bouncing chair, and he was pitching a temper tantrum. I have no idea what it was about, but I was telling him, look, Michael, reasoning with an eight-month-old, right? This is real smart of me. But I was telling him, look, you can cry when you're upset, but you can't have a temper tantrum. You can cry, though. Everybody cries. Even daddies cry. And Alan looked at me and said, yeah, Daddy, like you cried and Mommy cried when you took Michael back. And he looked at Michael. And he said, Daddy, is that Michael? The first time that he connected the fact that it was really the same baby. And of course it was. I could go into a lot more detail, but I won't. There's a lot more drama yet to come. Many of you have seen Michael. He's now a strapping 21-year-old in the 4th Division in Colorado. So you know that the court date arrived. They gave up their parental rights, and the adoption was finalized a few weeks later. Without that message on memorials, though, on that video, I would never have trusted God enough to pray for Michael's return. Without doubt, it wouldn't have happened without God's grace. When I finally faced the facts that I needed to pray for him to come back, and I finally realized that there was nothing I could do about it, moving forward wasn't going to do it, God helped me to trust him. Paul wrote in Romans 12:3 and in 1 Corinthians 12 that even the faith we have, the trust we have, comes from God. And that's where I was. I was going through a horrible, horrible situation. But God got me through by causing me to simply trust him. I'm not saying that when we go through difficult times, we always get what we ask for. That's usually not even the case. But what I am saying is that when we go through difficult times, there's a good result because God uses those troubles to bring us along to him. Paul wrote in Romans 5, we can rejoice too when we run into problems and trials, for we know that they help develop endurance. And endurance develops strength of character. That's the fruit of the Spirit coming out of us. And character strengthens our confident hope. That is trust in God. That's what happens when problems occur in our life. Paul had an experience. He talked about it in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. He said in verse 8, "We don't want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we experienced in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt we had received the sentence of death." I have no idea what these guys were going through, but it was horrific. They thought they were going to die. And they might have even felt at that moment that might be the best thing. You say, why in the world do bad things like this happen to good Christian people? It doesn't make any sense, except it does when you have the right perspective. Take a look at the second part of verse 9. But this happened so that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God, who raises the dead. God can do that. He has done that. He has delivered us from such a deadly peril, and he will deliver us again. On him we have set our hope that he will continue to deliver us. So Paul and his team learned not to trust in themselves. Paul and his team learned to expect that God would deliver them again if necessary, and that expectation turned to an ongoing trust that God would always deliver them. That's the right perspective to have. The right perspective, the power of right perspective, lies in trusting God through everything, even when things are bad. There's a famous person, many of you have heard of her. Her name is Corrie ten Boom. She was in a Christian family that tried to protect Jews during the Holocaust in the Netherlands back in the 1940s. And when they were finally caught, all the Jews were hauled off to death camps, and her family was taken to prison, and she spent well over a year in Ravensbrück concentration camp in pretty miserable conditions. Take a look at what she said. When I try, I fail. When I trust, he succeeds. When troubles come in our life, it's because he's trying to help us to rely on him. I don't think God causes our troubles, but he uses our troubles. We need to have the right mindset, the right perspective, and take a look at those problems for what they are. They're really a blessing, because when we trust in God, so much is so much better. And it takes us along that path a little bit further. So, memorials. If you have some memorials in your life, look back at those things. Look back at those situations where God did something for you. And I could give you other stories, but this one took so long I won't. Let's close in prayer. We have a memorial coming up with the Pray and Go and with these other projects. We want to see how God is going to work in all these different areas and bless the community of St. Cloud through us as he works through us. So let's close this in prayer, and then Jonathan and the team will come up and share about Pray and Go.